The way we work has changed dramatically. Digital tools have enabled employees to work from anywhere, but they've also enabled employers to keep track of staff through device monitoring. Our research shows that over 70% of companies are either already using digital surveillance or plan to in the future. But over a third of those same companies admit they're seeing increased or even dramatically increased employee turnover. So when does effective management of remote teams start to become an invasion of privacy? VMware CIO Jason Conyard met Carissa Véliz, author and academic, to discuss the new world of work and hear why employee device monitoring needs a rethink.
Hello, I'm Jason Conyard, CIO and Senior Vice President at VMware. Carissa Véliz is author of Economist Book of the Year, Privacy is Power. Carissa has spoken regularly about why individuals should strive to take back control of their data and how failure to do so risks handing too much power to large corporations. Carissa, why do you believe employee device monitoring has no place at work?
Thank you so much. Of course, it's perfectly understandable that an employer has to have some sense of what the employee is doing. It would be totally nonsensical to pay an employee to do a job and then never come back and check hey, did you do that job? That would be unreasonable. But at the same time, there is a huge gradient of possibilities of how much we monitor people, from monitoring simply their results to essentially micromanaging each second of the day, possibly. And I think we have to be very careful with giving in to these pressures. There are pressures, but I think we should resist them for a variety of reasons. One of the most important achievements of the liberal state is the private sphere. The idea that you as a private citizen have a sphere in which, as long as you don't commit crimes, you have a lot of leeway of how you lead your life. And it's nobody's business to see what you do or what you don't do. And what I worry about is that increased monitoring in the workplace leads to work encroachment, such that you're never off work. You're receiving emails at 11 at night, you're expected to answer as soon as possible, and in some cases there have been lawsuits because employees realized that they were being tracked, their location was being tracked throughout the day, even outside of work hours. And of course, something like location data is incredibly sensitive. It can tell you whether a person is going to the hospital or a psychiatrist's office or an abortion clinic or so many other places that an employer has no right to know about and no reason to know about. So we have to be very careful that we don't undermine the private sphere and thereby undermine the liberal state and democracy in the process. So one way to think about it is, okay, apart from democracy and the liberal state, which is a pretty big deal, do employers also have a reason not to monitor employees? And I think the answer is yes. It's not only that we have to think about whether employees have the power to resist these technologies. I think employers have an interest that their employees are reasonably happy. It costs a lot of money to employ someone and then train them. Turnover is very expensive. If you force people to do something that they don't want to do and they think it's unfair and wrong, it's much more likely that people will try to cheat you. If employees feel that they're treated well, they can be in a relaxed environment and they can do their job properly, it's much more likely that you will have a collaboration in which the kind of goodwill goes way beyond whatever is in the contract. And I think everybody wants that. Everybody wants harmony in the workplace. We work for a long time, long hours, and it makes a difference in everybody's life. So I think even if we didn't have employee power and even if we didn't have regulation, as an employer, you have an interest that your employees are okay. And monitoring is something very, very stressful. So people during the pandemic have reported, even people who were in not a good place financially have quit their jobs because they have been monitored too much, and they have reported things like being so stressed out by the software that is monitoring their output that they can't even go to the bathroom in peace. And that's clearly way too much. Not to mention that with the pandemic, we are inviting our employers into our living rooms, into sometimes our bedrooms, And that is very problematic. Even if we were able to say, you're going to work from this time to this time, that's actually very artificial. During the pandemic, we have worked all hours, many times to the profit of employers, because we've worked much more in many cases than we used to. And it's not reasonable, for instance, for a family who has young children to tell them never to appear in the living room or wherever the computer might be. So it's very, very sensitive, and I think we should be very careful respecting that. But furthermore, I think employees do have a lot of power. If we had talked at the start of the Industrial Revolution, probably the big corporations then would have said, yeah, employees don't have enough power to have 8-hour shifts, but they did. And I think that surveillance is dangerous enough for society as a whole and uncomfortable enough for the individual that we can push back.
Our research has found that companies who are using device monitoring or are planning to use it to see what's happening in their environments are seeing a dramatic increase in employee turnover. And this is something that I think was touched on in previous points. Can I hear your thoughts? So as an example, do we think that it's primarily because of monitoring, or do we think that there are other contributing factors in terms of fatigue because of the pandemic or other things that are contributing to that shift in employment?
I mean, it's hard to tell, and we would need more evidence, of course. But I think a lot of it has to do with surveillance. At least in what I've read, there are a lot of reports in which people explicitly say, I quit because I couldn't deal with that level of surveillance. And also because many of these tech tools are so far very, very glitchy. We should have higher standards and make sure that these tools are working. But so far, the evidence that I've seen is that it just doesn't work that way. Companies are not doing their job in that sense well enough. And I think something related to surveillance is that when you're monitored, the level of stress goes up dramatically. And if you're in a company that is willing to monitor you to that extent and to force software sometimes on your device, sometimes even in your own house, then it's very likely that the culture of that company is not a very friendly one. I don't have evidence, but I would think that it's very likely that a company that does that does other things to pressure employees in a way that might make them uncomfortable and want to leave.
Thank you. Just speaking for myself as a CIO, and not commenting on the logic or value of monitoring or different approaches, but just recognizing that if we collect that data, companies and organizations have an obligation and a responsibility to protect that data. And I think that has many implications. That has legal implications, it has moral and ethical implications, and it also potentially has physical security implications to people's well-being. So I think any organization thinking about that needs to be particularly mindful and thoughtful about that. I'm going to shift now to a question about advice we might give. So as we see ourselves moving to this and potentially staying in this remote first world, there are a lot of digital tools, and we've touched on the tools. We've touched on the fact that they could be used for good and maybe even for ill as we make that shift. From your perspective, what are the best things that managers can do to ensure employee performance?
So I think the best thing is actually to have a good ambience, a good culture in which employees are motivated to do the job, and that they see the purpose of the job as being something that contributes to society. I think that's much more powerful than many people realize, as opposed to the kind of carrot and stick, more kind of crude kind of measures. So I'm very much in favor of monitoring employees' work through their output, rather than telling them exactly when they have to do it, how they have to do it, and managing that process. Because monitoring kills creativity. I mean, just think about having to do something very difficult that you have to concentrate, or having to do something in which you feel vulnerable, you're trying out things, you might get it wrong, and just imagine doing that while people are watching you. It just makes it so much more difficult. So in general, I would advise a backing off approach. And related to this, I think you're absolutely right, Jason, that it's so dangerous to have that personal data. And if you think that institutions that are so powerful and have so many resources and are so competent, like the FBI and the NSA, not even they have been able to keep their data safe, what chances do companies have of making absolutely sure they keep that personal data safe? It's very hard to keep personal data safe. Many people want it, and every personal data point that you have is a potential liability, a potential lawsuit. So I think employers are creating their own risk through having that kind of monitoring and storing that kind of personal data.
If I could add, whatever organizations choose to do and for whatever their motives, I would strongly encourage them to have a very clearly documented process and framework established. I think it's incredibly important that there is transparency, employees, in terms of what companies will do in terms of monitoring. I think it should also be very clear what the process is for those policies to change and for there to be notification when those policies change. So employees are aware of changes before they occur rather than finding out afterwards. I think that transparency is important as well as building that trust. So we're almost at time, but I'd like to get just one final quick piece of advice to organizations to consider. One thing you'd like people to take away from this conversation as they move forward.
I guess that many times when we think about, as companies, when companies think about the risk, many times they look outwards. They look at about how the economy is doing and how the competition is doing and all these risks and dangers that are out there. But I would like them to look inwards and think that you might be creating the risk. You might be your own biggest risk. And in that sense, if you monitor your employees in a way that makes them uncomfortable, or if you pressure them in ways that they think are unfair, and if you store personal data that you cannot possibly keep safe, you are creating your own risk.
Thank you, Carissa, for sharing your views today, and thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you so much.